This is the oldest financial trap in human history, and most people don't realize we're still living inside it. 3,000 years ago in Babylon, debt was not numbers on a screen. It was chains. One bad harvest, one failed loan, and a farmer lost his land. His children were taken as servants. His family name etched into clay as property. The records survive. Clay tablets list debts in silver and barley. Interest climbing year after year. What began as opportunity became a prison. At first, the wealthy thrived. Temples swelled, palaces glittered, but the farmers who fed the empire were crushed beneath impossible promises. And when resentment grew faster than harvest, Babylon's rulers faced a choice: keep the debts or keep the peace. Their answer was radical. They wiped the slate clean. Entire ledgers erased, families set free, fields restored. Why? Because even Babylon understood a truth we've nearly forgotten. Debt builds civilizations, but too much debt destroys them. Babylon was one of the first true cities of money. Its farmers sowed barley along the Euphrates. Its merchants sailed goods downriver toward the Persian Gulf. Its scribes pressed contracts into wet clay with a reed stylus, baking them into tablets that could last for centuries. But what made Babylon powerful was not just grain or trade, it was credit. Here's how it worked. A farmer needed seed for planting. He could borrow barley from a neighbor with interest to be repaid at harvest. A merchant needed silver for a caravan. He could borrow from a temple storehouse, promising repayment with goods brought back from distant markets. A family facing drought or flood could pledge land or labor as collateral, buying time until fortune turned, and every agreement was written down. No handshakes, no guesses. The terms, principal, interest, repayment date were impressed into clay. That clay became the contract, unchanging, undeniable. This was revolutionary. For the first time, wealth could move across time. A farmer could borrow in spring and repay in autumn. A merchant could borrow today and repay after a long journey. Credit turned Babylon into a financial engine, far more flexible than simple barter. But it also carried danger. Interest rates could be crushing. Some loans doubled in just a few years. Harvest failed. Caravans were robbed, and when the borrower could not pay, the contract did not vanish. It hardened like the clay itself. Babylon discovered both sides of credit, the power to build and the power to break. At first, credit looked like progress. Farmers planted more seed, merchants sailed farther, cities bustled with trade. But over time, the balance tipped. The problem was interest. Babylonian loans often carried rates of 20% for silver and 33% for barley. On a clay tablet, those numbers looked manageable. In real life, they were merciless. A farmer who borrowed 10 shekels of silver might owe 12 at harvest. If rains failed, the debt rolled forward. 12 became 14, then 17, then 20. A single bad season could trigger a chain reaction lasting years, and Babylonian law was strict. Debt was not just an entry on a tablet, it was an obligation enforced with land, labor, and lives. If you couldn't pay, your field could be seized. If your field wasn't enough, your children could be taken as servants. If your children weren't enough, you yourself could be pledged into bondage. This was not rare. Clay records survive of families losing multiple generations to debt, their names carried in lists as household property. The wealthy, of course, profited. Temples collected interest, nobles absorbed farmland, lenders secured cheap labor. The city glowed with palaces and ziggurats, funded by the suffering of those who lived just outside their walls. But below the surface, cracks formed. The very farmers who produced Babylon's grain were disappearing into servitude. Villages emptied. Fields went unplowed. Resentment grew, and when resentment grows faster than harvest, stability begins to rot. Debt had turned from a tool of growth into a machine of collapse. Babylon's rulers were not fools. They understood the arithmetic. If debt swallowed too many families, who would plant the fields? Who would serve in the army? Who would pay the temple tax? So from time to time, Babylon's kings reached for a radical solution. They broke their own system. On clay tablets preserved for thousands of years, we can still read the decrees. Words that sent shockwaves through the empire. All debts are forgiven. Servants shall go free. Fields shall be returned to their owners. In one stroke, contracts were erased. Families walked home from bondage. Land was restored to its original clans. Creditors lost their claims, but the kingdom gained something more valuable: peace. This was not generosity, it was survival. Without a clean slate, Babylon risked revolt, famine, even civil war. By wiping the tablets clean, kings bought breathing room. They reset trust before it shattered completely. And here lies a lesson that rippled far beyond Babylon. Centuries later, Other cultures preserve the same idea, that debts cannot be allowed to pile without limit, that society itself depends on limits to exploitation, that forgiveness, however costly, is sometimes the only way forward. For the poor farmer, the decree was salvation. For the wealthy lender, it was outrage. But for the city as a whole, it was balance, fragile, temporary, but necessary. Babylon discovered what every empire must face. Money is not only numbers, it is the trust of the people. And when debt destroys that trust, forgiveness becomes more powerful than interest. But not every king chose mercy. Some rulers clung to the tablets. They let the debt stand even as interest swallowed households. They sided with the creditors, hoping temple wealth and noble loyalty would outweigh the cries of the poor. The result was predictable. Villages emptied. Farmers abandoned the land rather than watch it pass to another man's ledger. Bands of debtors fled into the hills, forming groups that raided caravans or joined rival kings. The empire weakened not from invasion, but from within. Even Babylon's priests recorded the unrest. Temples that once received steady offerings found their storerooms bare. A population ground down by debt could not also support the gods. The very legitimacy of the king was questioned because he no longer protected the people who fed his throne. And history tells us this pattern repeated. Periods of forgiveness brought stability. Periods of hardness brought revolt. Babylon's wealthiest gained short-term power by holding debt tight, but every time, society paid the long-term cost. This is why the clean slate was not charity. It was statecraft. Without it, the system threatened to devour itself. And it is here that Babylon's story begins to sound less like ancient history and more like a warning, because every society faces the same question. What happens when promises can no longer be paid, yet the ledgers keep demanding? Babylon's clean slate decrees did not stay in Babylon. The idea traveled. It was remembered, retold, reshaped by other cultures wrestling with the same problem. In one tradition, laws spoke of returning land to its families after a set number of years. Servants would be released, debts would be forgiven. It was written not as politics, but as justice, the belief that a society cannot endure if money hardens into chains. In another tradition, prophets railed against false weights and dishonest scales. They thundered that cheating the measure of money was not just bad economics, it was an offense against heaven itself. And centuries later, when teachers spoke of forgiveness, they did not stop at sins. They spoke of debts too, as if the burden of money and the burden of guilt were two sides of the same coin. For the faithful, these echoes are clear. For others, they are wisdom in another form. The lesson is the same. If debt is allowed to grow without mercy, it will consume the very people needed to keep society alive. Babylon may have been the first to learn this lesson, but it was far from the last. It is tempting to leave Babylon's story in the dust of the ancient world. Clay tablets, barley loans, silver shekels, surely that has nothing to do with us. But look closer. The patterns are uncomfortably familiar. Today, families borrow not seed and barley, but student loans and mortgages. The numbers may be written in digital code instead of clay, but the weight feels the same. Young workers spend decades under obligations that outlast the value they gained. Parents measure every month, not in grain, but in payments due. In 2008, global markets nearly collapsed under the weight of promises that could not be kept. Mortgages were bundled, sold, and resold until they bore no resemblance to the homes they represented. When the bills came due, governments faced the same dilemma Babylonian kings once faced: enforce the contracts and watch society unravel, or wipe the slate clean for the sake of survival. The solution was familiar: bailouts, debt restructuring, a partial reset of the system to prevent full collapse. Different tools, same impulse. And look wider. Nations today struggle under sovereign debt so large that repayment is measured not in years, but in lifetimes. Countries borrow against futures they may never see, just as Babylon's farmers once borrowed against harvests that never came. Greece in the 2010s, Argentina more than once, even the United States wrestling with debt ceilings, each faces the Babylonian problem. How long can the numbers rise before the trust breaks? The echoes reach into everyday life too. Credit cards, buy now, pay later apps, payday loans, modern tools that promise flexibility but often deliver bondage. Just as Babylonian interest compounded silently on tablets, today's debt snowballs in statements, fees, and penalties until it consumes households. And then there is war. Babylon fought campaigns it could not fully pay for, stretching its treasury thin. Modern powers do the same, funding conflicts and commitments with borrowed money. The battlefield may be different, but the arithmetic is not. Wars are always paid for in coin, whether minted in silver or printed in paper. The story echoes again and again. debt can fuel growth, but if left unchecked, it becomes a trap. When too many are caught, rulers must choose mercy or revolt. Babylon's clay tablets are long broken, but the lesson they carry is still sharp. No society, ancient or modern, can survive when debt is allowed to harden into chains. Babylon's story is not ancient trivia. It is a mirror. Back then, rulers wiped ledgers clean to prevent collapse. Today, we disguise it with new words: bailouts, stimulus, restructuring. Different names, same survival instinct. But here's the dangerous part. Every reset shifts the cost. In Babylon, creditors paid. In modern times, it is often ordinary people who lose savings, wages, and futures. So here's the question history leaves us. How much longer can debts climb before trust breaks again? If wars are funded by promises, who will carry the bill when the promises fail? And when the next reset comes, because it always comes, will you be protected or will you pay for mistakes you never made? Babylon teaches us that debt is never free, never infinite, never harmless. It is always a bargain with the future, and the future always collects.